This is Arise America.
The gun manufacturer Glock is being sued over the New York subway shooting in April. Elnan Stowe, who was injured in the shooting, accuses Glock of fueling a public nuisance. The lawsuit highlights the firm's marketing strategy and says Glock has intentionally produced more guns than legitimate buyers need, creating a secondary market where its weapons are resold in places like pawn shops. Well, let's bring in Arise International correspondent Faith Orr, who's in New York. Faith, we've just heard there's a lawsuit being launched against Glock following the shooting in New York, but that's not the only thing that's underway. Tell us what measures are being put in place in the city to stem the violence.
Today from the Mayor, Eric Adams, and he is set to appoint a gun violence SAR to try and stop the seemingly endless shootings here in New York City. At this stage, there's gun violence in pretty much every borough, every weekend. Now, we expect Andre T. Mitchell to get the job. He is the founder of the Brooklyn-based anti-violence group Man Up. His exact duties haven't been revealed, but we do know that that's just one of a number of measures that Adams is looking at. He's also considering imposing a state of emergency in the city in an effort to combat gun violence. That would be on top of looking into deploying random gun scanners at subway stations and bus terminals. Adams says that many of the guns are coming into New York City from the south. These new measures, of course, in addition to the random bag checks that police already carry out on the subway and at bus terminals. Now, summer typically marks an uptick in violence here in New York, and to try and stop that this year, several community groups have come together to launch the Safe Summer Initiative. It's hoped it'll build relationships between the city's grassroots organisations and some residents, and that in doing this and building these relationships, more people will feel comfortable coming forward, sharing information about where violence is taking place, so that interventions can happen and stop violence before it happens.
And there's new legal restrictions being introduced by the governor as well, I believe.
Yes, so New York is set to become one of the first states in the US to pass a package of new gun measures following the shootings in Texas and, of course, in Buffalo and New York State. Now, these new laws sought by Governor Kathy Hochul would further tighten and strengthen New York's gun laws. They're already reasonably strict in comparison to some states here. Now, for instance, it would raise the age from 18 to 21 for anyone who wants to purchase a semi-automatic rifle, like the ones used in the recent shootings. It would also ban the sale of body armor, limit that to law enforcement, to military. You know, again, we saw there a security guard in Buffalo tried to retaliate against the shooter, but his bullets little impact because the shooter was wearing body armor. So the governor wants to make sure that can't happen again. She's also trying to compel police to use the red flag law. Now, what that means is that it's already a law, it's in existence, and anyone who presents as a threat to themselves or to anyone else can have their guns temporarily removed by police. And this was something that could, again, have stopped the Buffalo shooter. He had, there was various red flags around his postings online. He'd been seen by mental health professionals, and they could have taken his guns away if they'd used this law, but they didn't. So now the governor wants to force police to use this. It's unusual because lawmakers often hesitate to act in an election year. The governor, lots of legislators here up for re-election, but they're framing this as a way to combat the gun violence. And, they think that it's a big issue for voters. There is also a fear here that through the Supreme Court, the Mayor, Eric Adams, is warning that the Supreme Court could overturn the state's limited ban on concealed carry permits so that you can't just walk around with a weapon in your pocket. He says that if this happens, the streets of New York will become more dangerous.
Now, more broadly, there is public support for common sense gun control measures, such as universal background checks. Why are these not being passed by legislators?
Exactly. So background checks are one of the least controversial aspects of gun legislation. Roughly 80 to 90% of Americans support them. That would mean that all sellers would have to verify that a person doesn't have a history of violent crime, domestic abuse before they can buy a gun. Now, this, support for this actually polls higher than people who support ice cream. So it's not controversial at all, but it hasn't been translated into political action, particularly from Republicans. And that's because they would need to cross the aisle to support this legislation, and they fear it would then harm them in state primaries. It would harm them with their own party. 21 states already do require background checks, but only at federally licensed gun dealers, so not at like gun shows or online or private sales. So there's still the big loophole there. And then even the states that do have the restrictions suffer from this influx of guns from states that don't have restrictions. Now we're seeing this, generally a revived effort in trying to pass these gun laws in the wake of mass shootings. But rather unusually, in Republican-held legislatures, there are more gun laws passed after a mass shooting, but they're pro-gun. They're less strict. They make it easier to carry weapons, which of course is not what most of the public are saying they want to happen. Part of the issue of all this is that even where a majority of Americans agree, to get things through the Senate, you need more than a simple majority of politicians. And the filibuster in the Senate then allows basically a minority of states, a minority of Americans, and a minority of lawmakers to veto national policy that the majority of people want. So the result we're seeing, is this minority of people making the laws for most of America, regardless of what the population thinks overall.
Now tonight, Faith, President Biden is due to address the nation, calling out for in effect stricter gun laws and more control. I mean, how effective is this speech likely? I do remember when President Obama was in the White House and he was seeing another spate of mass shootings. In the end, he just turned to lawmakers and said, "I can't do any more. It's down to you." It's almost a similar situation, really.
It's almost identical. I mean, especially because, again, that was after a school shooting with Obama when he made that now famous speech. And Biden has very much said the same. He's already spoken a few times in the wake of these shootings. And of course, we saw him visit Buffalo. We saw him visit Uvalde and try to offer comfort to people. But he said himself that there's nothing he can really do at an executive power level. And it is down to Congress. And he can, try and encourage them. But at the end of the day, it's up to the politicians. It's not up to the president. He, as I say, we've heard speeches from him saying that this has to end. He said that he believes as a president he's probably seen more mass shootings than other presidents in history. And he says, it has to end. There has to be an end in sight for this. But the problem is trying to get Republican colleagues to agree to cross the aisle to meet the Democrats somewhere, in the middle, and have these gun laws changed. Because a lot of them say, a lot of members of the public say, well, we do support common sense measures, but then of course common sense varies depending on who you speak to, what measures they support. And it's just such a polarizing issue that actually the president can't do much about.
It's interesting that one of the most powerful people in the world, but at the end of the day, he's, as you say, got no power at all. But for now, Faith, thank you very much indeed for your analysis.
This is Arise America.